Do I hear 600 for the Wind Girl? Come now, gentlemen. Surely her father's debts don't diminish her breeding. The gavel struck the holy wooden altar, a sickening hollow thud that echoed through the nave. Clara yanked her wrist out of the deputy's sweaty grip. It was a violent, sharp gesture. Her nails dug into her own palms until the skin nearly broke. She did not tremble. She did not weep. She just burned. A quiet, suffocating anger boiled in her veins. The church of Cedar Falls was packed to the rafters, not for a Sunday sermon, for a slaughter. Harold Fitzgerald, the banker with a smile as sharp as a straight razor, stood at the pulpit. He called it Christian charity, a marriage auction to settle the debts of the deceased. Her father, Thomas Wynne, had been dead barely a month, and already his legacy was dragged through the mud, buried under forged promissory notes and whispers. Clara glared at the congregation. The suffocating stench of unwashed wool, cheap cologne, and raw hypocrisy clogged her throat. These were men who had dined at her father's table, men who had shaken his hand. Now their eyes crawled over her, calculating, hungry, stripping her bare of her dignity. 650! A rough voice shouted from the back. The butcher, a man known for heavy hands and a cruel temper. Clara locked her jaw tight enough to crack her teeth. She wanted to scream. She wanted to tear the church down bare-handed. But she was trapped. A woman with no family, no money, no voice, in a world ruled by ledgers and men's lies. 700! Fitzgerald smiled, his gold tooth catching a sliver of the spring sunlight. 700, going once, going twice. The heavy oak gavel raised high in the air, the final nail in her coffin. Clara kept her eyes wide open. She refused to look away. Crash! The heavy oak doors of the church were violently kicked open. The iron hinges screamed in protest. A blast of freezing mountain wind swept through the aisle, extinguishing the altar candles in a single, violent breath. Silence. A heavy, terrified silence crashed over the crowd. A massive silhouette filled the doorway. He was a mountain of a man, wrapped in thick wolf furs, smelling of pine needles, fresh snow, and wild earth. His face was weathered, hardened by a decade of brutal isolation, half hidden behind a wild, dark beard. Silas Boon, the beast of Elkhorn Ridge. The congregation parted like a frightened flock of sheep. Grown men took hasty steps back. Women gasped, pulling their shawls tight. Silas didn't even look at them. His heavy leather boots thudded against the wooden floorboards, echoing like a heartbeat in the dead quiet. He walked straight down the aisle, his eyes fixed on the altar. Fitzgerald lowered the gavel, his polite mask slipping into genuine fear. "Boon, you have no business." "I haven't seen a woman in 10 years," Silas interrupted. His voice was a low, terrifying rumble that vibrated deep in Clara's chest. He didn't wait for permission. He didn't bargain. Silas reached into his heavy coat, pulled out a thick leather pouch, and slammed it onto the communion table. The sound of heavy gold coins clinking together was deafening. $3,000, Silas stated, his piercing gray eyes locking onto Fitzgerald. "She's mine." Before the banker could speak, before the crowd could breathe, Silas turned to Clara. He didn't grab her violently. He didn't drag her. He simply held out a massive, calloused hand. Clara stared at the hand. Her anger warred with sheer shock, but anything, even the beast of the mountain, was better than the wolves in this room. She placed her shaking hand in his. An hour later, the forced, Hasty vows were spoken. They were sitting in his rugged timber wagon, the cold mountain wind biting at her cheeks as Cedar Falls disappeared into the valley below. Silas reached into his coat and tossed a heavy iron key into her lap. "The cabin is yours," he said, staring straight ahead at the snowy trail. "You can touch anything, rearrange anything, but the cellar door behind the pantry—" He paused, his jaw tightening, his knuckles white on the reins. "You never touch it. You don't ask about it. Understood?" Clara gripped the cold iron key, a locked door, a forbidden secret. She slowly turned her head to look back down the mountain. Far below, at the edge of the tree line, 3 riders had already separated from the town. They weren't moving. They were just sitting on their horses, staring up the ridge, watching the wagon disappear into the shadows. Before we follow Clara into the dark heart of the mountain, tell me, where in the world are you listening to this story from right now? The wooden wheels of the wagon ground against the frozen, unforgiving mud, a relentless, bone-jarring rhythm. Clara sat as stiff as a loaded rifle. Her jaw ached from clenching it shut. The frigid mountain air bit viciously through her thin cotton dress, turning her skin to ice, but she refused to shiver. She stared straight ahead at the muscular back of the draft horse, pulling them upward into the mist. Anger, thick, suffocating and hot, kept her warm. She slowly rubbed her wrist. The red, bruised fingerprints of the deputy were still burning on her pale skin, a parting gift from the righteous men of Cedar Falls. She cut her eyes sideways to the giant sitting next to her, Silas Boon. He held the thick leather reins with hands the size of bear paws. He hadn't spoken a single syllable since his grim warning about the cellar door. He didn't gloat over his purchase. He didn't look at her like a prize he had just bought at a cattle market. He simply stared at the treacherous, snowy path, his jaw set in stone. A sudden, violent gust of wind whipped down from the peaks. Clara instinctively flinched, biting her lower lip hard enough to taste copper, desperately trying to keep her teeth from chattering. Without turning his massive head, Silas let go of the reins with one hand. He reached behind the wooden bench, grabbed a heavy, thick wolf fur blanket, and tossed it over her shivering shoulders. It was heavy. It smelled of wood smoke, old leather, and him. Clara stiffened immediately. Her quiet anger flared. She grabbed the rough edge of the fur, ready to throw it right back at his boots. She didn't want his pity. She didn't want anything from a man who had bought her with a pouch of gold. "I am not cold," she lied. Her voice was tight, sharp with hostility. Silas didn't even blink. He didn't look at her. "The wind on Elkhorn doesn't care about your pride," he rumbled, his voice a low vibration beneath the howling wind. "Keep it on, or freeze, makes no difference to me." He didn't reach out to pull it tighter around her. He didn't force her. He just left the choice entirely in her hands. Clara's grip on the fur trembled. She didn't throw it back. She pulled it infinitesimally closer to her neck. That was the first tiny crack in her armor, not fear, confusion. Why didn't he demand her gratitude? Her mind violently dragged her back to the humiliating crawl out of town just an hour ago. The memory tasted like bitter ash. As the heavy wagon had lumbered down the main street, the good, God-fearing people of Cedar Falls had lined the wooden sidewalks like spectators at a hanging. No one had offered a weapon. No one had stepped in front of the wheels. They just watched. Mrs. Higgins, a woman who had drunk sweet tea in Clara's parlor just 3 months ago, violently yanked her young son inside and slammed the door shut. The town blacksmith, a man whose crippling debts her father had quietly forgiven, spat a dark wad of tobacco into the dirt right as the wagon wheels passed him. And the whispers, they slithered through the freezing air like venomous snakes. "He's taking her up to his cave. Did you see the size of him? Lord, she won't survive the week. The beast has to eat." Then the loudest voice of all, a drunken deputy leaning against the saloon post, laughing until his face turned purple. "Save us a bone, Boon, if she's too tough to chew." Clara had turned just for a second to look back at the church steps. Harold Fitzgerald stood there. His hands were neatly folded behind his back. His eyes were dead, calculating, and chillingly calm. He wasn't angry about losing the auction. He looked satisfied, like a spider watching a fly stumble out of one web only to fall blindly into another. The wagon hit a deep, violent rut, snapping her back to the icy present. The town was gone. Only the towering, suffocating black pines surrounded them now. The world of men was behind her. The world of the beast lay ahead. It is easy to preach of righteousness in the warm, safe pews of a crowded church. It is easy to laugh with the mob when you are not the one standing humiliated on the auction block. But it takes a warrior's heart to stand alone against a tide of pure hypocrisy. Ask yourself, in that frozen, desperate moment, as a whole town watched a woman being led to the slaughter, would you have turned your back in silence? Or would you have risked everything to offer a hand? The incline of Elkhorn Ridge grew brutally steep. The world of men slowly vanished, swallowed whole by a sprawling, unforgiving ocean of black pines and blinding white snow. The air up here was different. It was thin, sharp. It burned the lungs and numbed the skin. Clara sat rigidly on the wooden bench. Every violent jolt of the wagon threw her shoulder inches from Silas's massive arm, but she refused to let them touch. She braced her boots against the floorboards, her muscles aching from the sheer effort of staying upright. She was exhausted, but her anger, that quiet, burning furnace inside her chest, refused to let her slump. She hated the town that had sold her. She hated the banker who had orchestrated it. And she fiercely resented the giant sitting next to her, who had bought her freedom only to drag her into this frozen wasteland. Silas didn't speak. He hadn't said a word since they left the valley. He handled the massive draft horse with subtle, effortless shifts of the reins. Suddenly the wind died down. An eerie, suffocating silence fell over the mountain. Silas's head snapped up. His gray eyes narrowed, scanning the dense tree line below them. He pulled back on the heavy leather reins. Whoa! The horse stopped instantly. Clara frowned, her hostility spiking. "Why are we stopping? Are you—" Silas raised a massive, calloused hand, a silent, absolute command. He didn't look at her. He just listened. For 3 agonizing seconds, there was nothing but the sound of the horse's heavy breathing misting in the freezing air. Then Clara heard it. Crack! A dry branch snapping under a heavy hoof. It echoed faintly from the switchback trail, maybe half a mile below them. Someone was following them. Silas didn't panic. His face was carved from the very granite of the mountain. With terrifying speed, he reached under the wagon seat and pulled out a battered Winchester repeating rifle. Click-clack. The metallic sound of the lever-action chambering around was deafening in the quiet woods. "Get down," Silas ordered. His voice was a low, dangerous growl. Clara's jaw tightened. She didn't cower. She didn't hide her face in her hands. She turned to him, her eyes blazing with defiance. "I am not a dog to be ordered around. Who is down there?" Silas finally looked at her. His eyes were cold, calculating, and completely devoid of pity. "Men who don't care that you're a woman, get down!" He didn't wait for her to obey. Silas violently cracked the reins, but instead of continuing up the exposed trail, he violently jerked the horse to the left, plunging the heavy wagon off the path and straight down a steep, treacherous embankment. Clara gasped, grabbing the iron rail as the wagon tilted dangerously. They crashed into a shallow, half-frozen creek hidden beneath the pines. Ice shattered like glass. Freezing black water splashed up, soaking the hem of Clara's dress, biting into her skin like 1,000 needles. "Higher!" Silas roared, driving the horse straight up the center of the icy creek. The rushing water would mask their tracks. He stood up slightly in the wagon, steering with one hand, holding the heavy rifle steady in the other, his eyes locked on the woods behind them. The smell of wet pine and freezing water suddenly vanished. A suffocating wave of heat washed over Silas. The coppery, sickening stench of fresh blood and burning timber violently invaded his lungs. The sound of the rushing creek faded, replaced by the agonizing screams of a woman inside a burning farmhouse. 10 years ago, the Kellerman gang, the night he became the beast. Silas blinked hard, his jaw clenching so tight the muscles bulged. The icy mountain air slammed back into him. The memory shattered. He was here, now. He lowered the rifle slightly. The shadows in the woods below remained still. Whoever was hunting them had lost the trail at the water's edge. For now, Silas steered the exhausted horse out of the creek, hauling the wagon up a hidden rocky path that no ordinary man could have navigated. 10 minutes later, the trees finally broke. They emerged into a small, hidden clearing shielded by towering cliffs. In the center stood a heavy hand-hewn log cabin. It looked immovable, built to withstand sieges and storms alike. A thin ribbon of white smoke drifted lazily from the stone chimney. Silas pulled the wagon to a halt. He secured the rifle, jumped down into the deep snow, and walked around to her side. He didn't offer a hand this time. He just stood there, waiting for her to climb down. As Clara stood up, her frozen legs trembled. She slipped on the icy wood of the wagon step. Before she could fall, Silas caught her. His massive hands gripped her waist. The sheer strength in his grip was terrifying, yet he set her down into the snow with surprising, almost unnatural gentleness. He immediately stepped back, putting distance between them as he turned toward the cabin. The heavy wolf fur coat shifted. Clara's eyes locked onto a strange rectangular bulge hidden deep inside his inner pocket. He patted it once, a quick, almost obsessive gesture, before his eyes darted toward the back corner of the cabin, where the pantry was. "Inside," Silas commanded softly, his back already to her. "Before you freeze." Clara stood in the snow, her fists clenched at her sides. The danger from the town had passed. The freezing journey was over. But as she stared at the massive wooden door of the cabin and remembered the forbidden room waiting in the dark, she realized the real battle had just begun. The heavy oak door slammed shut, cutting off the howling wind. Inside, the cabin was submerged in a deep, freezing twilight. Clara stood frozen by the entrance. Her back was pressed hard against the solid wood. Her eyes darted around the single room, sharp and defensive, cataloging every shadow, every axe, every hunting knife hung on the log walls. It was a fortress, and she was locked inside with him. Silas didn't look at her. He didn't lock the door behind her. He walked straight to the stone hearth, shedding his heavy wolf fur coat. Underneath, his flannel shirt stretched tight across broad, powerful shoulders. With a few precise, practiced strikes of flint and steel, a spark caught the dry kindling. Firelight erupted, casting long, dancing shadows across his bearded face. Clara crossed her arms tight across her chest. Her fingers dug into her sleeves. The anger still burned fiercely in her throat, but her body was betraying her. She was shivering violently. Silas stood up. He walked to the wooden table, picked up a battered tin cup, and poured steaming black coffee from a pot kept near the coals. He didn't bring it to her. He didn't command her to drink. He simply set the steaming cup on the very edge of the table closest to her. Then he deliberately stepped back, retreating to the far corner of the room to unbuckle his gun belt. He was giving her space. Clara stared at the tin cup. The steam curled into the freezing air, smelling of rich, bitter chicory. Her pride screamed at her to refuse, to throw it on the floor. But the brutal cold won. She took a cautious step forward, snatching the cup. The heat seared through the thin metal, biting into her numb palms. She drank. The dark liquid burned a trail down her throat, thawing the ice in her blood. She watched him over the rim of the cup. He was a giant, a man who could snap her neck with one hand. Yet, his movements were terrifyingly quiet, methodical. Clara set the cup down. "I am not helpless," she stated, her voice tight, echoing sharply in the quiet cabin. "I can work for my keep." Silas paused, his back still to her. He slowly turned. "You don't owe me anything." His voice was a low, heavy rumble. "You bought me," she snapped, the quiet anger finally spilling over. $3,000. Men do not pay that kind of money for nothing. So tell me, Mr. Boon, what are my chores?" Silas stared at her. His piercing gray eyes didn't hold anger. They didn't hold lust. They held a deep, ancient exhaustion. "Your chore," he said quietly, "is to thaw out." He turned away. Clara gritted her teeth. She refused to be useless. She refused to be a pet kept in a cage. She marched toward the hearth. Reaching for the heavy cast-iron stew pot hanging over the fire, intending to serve the food herself. Her fingers gripped the iron handle. She lifted. A sharp, agonizing spike of pain shot through her right wrist, exactly where the deputy had violently grabbed her back at the church. Clara gasped. Her grip gave out. The heavy iron pot slipped, tilting dangerously toward the roaring flames. She braced for the burning splash. It never came. A massive hand shot out from the shadows. Calloused, rough fingers clamped firmly over hers, wrapping around her small bruised hand and the thick iron handle all at once. Silas! He had moved with terrifying, impossible speed. He didn't snatch the pot away. He simply absorbed the crushing weight of it, his hand covering hers. Time seemed to stop. Clara froze. She could feel the searing heat of the fire on her face, but it was nothing compared to the heat of his skin against hers. His hand was rough, scarred like tree bark. He smelled of wood smoke, pine resin, and leather. She slowly looked up. He was standing entirely too close. His massive chest rose and fell in a slow, controlled rhythm. For the first time, Clara looked directly into his eyes. They weren't the wild, dead eyes of a beast. They were startlingly clear, deep, and incredibly gentle. He didn't pull away immediately. He looked down at her small hand, trapped beneath his. His thumb, almost imperceptibly, brushed over the dark, ugly bruise on her pale wrist. A feather-light touch from a man who could break stones. Clara's breath hitched. The suffocating anger in her chest suddenly faltered, replaced by a strange, terrifying flutter. "Let it go," Silas murmured, his voice softer than she thought possible. She slowly opened her fingers. He took the heavy pot effortlessly and set it securely on the stone hearth. He stepped back immediately, clearing his throat, the distance between them returning. "I'll get more wood," he muttered gruffly, grabbing his coat. He didn't look at her as he walked out into the freezing night, pulling the heavy door shut behind him. Clara stood alone in the warm cabin. She rubbed her wrist. It still hurt, but the skin where he had touched her was burning. Outside, the mountain wind howled. Silas stood in the knee-deep snow, the cold biting at his face. He walked toward the woodpile, but his eyes were scanning the dark tree line. He stopped. There, near a broken pine branch, a footprint in the fresh snow. It was shallow, the sharp, unmistakable curve of a spurred riding boot. Silas's jaw tightened. He knelt, touching the frozen edge of the print. They had tracked him further than he thought. They were circling the cabin, testing the perimeter. The smell of the sharp pine needles suddenly vanished. A wave of suffocating heat blasted into his face. The sickening metallic stench of fresh blood filled his nose. The peaceful white snow melted into a blazing inferno. He heard the deafening crack of a burning roof beam giving way. He saw his father's body lying motionless in the dirt, the shadows of the Kellerman gang laughing in the dark. Silas squeezed his eyes shut. His massive hands curled into fists, shaking violently. He forced his eyes open. The snow returned. The fire was gone, but the monsters were still here. He grabbed an armful of wood and marched back to the cabin. When he opened the door, Clara was sitting at the table eating quietly. Silas didn't speak. He walked to the far corner of the room, tossing a thick bedroll onto the hard, drafty floorboards right in front of the front door. Clara stopped eating. She looked at the single, large feather bed tucked warmly in the alcove near the fire. Then she looked at him, arranging his blankets on the freezing floor. "What are you doing?" she asked, her voice guarded. Silas unholstered his heavy Colt revolver, checked the cylinder, and laid it deliberately on the floor next to his bedroll. "Sleeping," he replied. "There is a bed," she pointed out, her anger entirely gone, replaced by profound confusion. Silas finally looked up at her. He looked at the bruised woman the town had thrown away, sitting in the warm glow of his hearth. "The bed is yours, Clara," he said simply. He used her name for the first time. It sounded heavy on his tongue, spoken with an almost sacred reverence. He lay down on the hard floor, turning his back to the room, placing his massive body squarely between her and the only door leading outside. Clara sat in the silence. She looked at the giant sleeping on the floor. Then, slowly, her eyes drifted to the back of the cabin, to the locked pantry door. The beast was protecting her from the outside world. But what was he hiding in the dark? The fire had died down to a dull, glowing red. The cabin was plunged into freezing, heavy shadows. Clara lay awake in the feather bed. She stared at the log ceiling, listening to the rhythmic, deep breathing of the giant sleeping on the hard floor across the door. He had given her his bed. He had shielded her from the town. He had touched her bruised wrist with the gentleness of a saint. But the locked pantry door in the back corner of the room pulled at her like a magnet. She threw off the warm wolf fur. The floorboards were like blocks of ice against her bare feet. She moved silently, holding her breath, creeping toward the back of the cabin. She reached the heavy wooden door. She didn't have the key, but as she ran her fingers along the rough frame, a cold draft hit her knuckles. It wasn't coming from beneath the door. It was coming from the loose wooden paneling right beside it. Clara knelt. She wedged her fingers into the gap between the thick pine boards and pulled. Crick! The sound was as loud as a gunshot in the dead quiet. "I told you." A low, dangerous voice rumbled from the darkness behind her. "Never to touch that." Clara gasped, spinning around. Silas was standing there. He hadn't made a single sound. His massive frame blocked out the dying firelight. His eyes were dark, unreadable pools in the shadows. A weaker woman would have apologized. A weaker woman would have cowered. Clara stood up, her chin lifted. The quiet anger that had kept her alive all day flared to life. "You sleep on the floor to protect me?" she whispered fiercely, "but you keep secrets in the walls. I am done being kept in the dark, Mr. Boon. What is behind this wood?" Silas stepped closer. The sheer size of him was overwhelming. He looked down at her defiant, pale face. He saw the fire in her eyes. She wasn't afraid of the beast. She was demanding the truth. A heavy, ragged sigh escaped his chest. He didn't yell. He didn't push her away. "Step back," he commanded softly. Silas reached down to the heavy iron fireplace poker. He didn't use the key. He jammed the iron tip straight into the gap of the wooden paneling and ripped backward with terrifying force. Wood splintered violently. Nails shrieked as they were torn from the beams. He reached into the dark, dusty, hollow space between the walls and pulled out a heavy, dirt-caked leather satchel. He didn't open it. He simply held it out to her. "I didn't lock it away to hide it from you," Silas said, his voice thick with an old, suffocating grief. "I locked it away because once you see what's inside, you can never go back to the life you knew." Clara stared at the satchel. Her heart pounded furiously against her ribs. She took it. It was heavy. She carried it to the heavy oak table. Silas lit a single oil lantern, casting a sickly yellow circle of light over the worn leather. Clara unbuckled the straps. Inside were papers, stacks of ledgers, old letters, and a thick journal. She opened the first ledger. It belonged to Jacob Morrison, the late clerk at Fitzgerald's Bank. She read the neat, terrified handwriting. 1876. Emergency fund diverted. $4,000. Harold Fitzgerald's orders. 1881. Payment to the Kellerman gang. $500. To clear the Boon family from Elkhorn Ridge. He wants the underground spring. Clara stopped breathing. The Kellerman gang. The men Silas had killed. The reason he was exiled as a beast. She slowly looked up at Silas. He was staring at the lantern flame, his face rigid, his hands trembling slightly. The smell of burning oil vanished. The cabin faded. Clara was suddenly drowning in a wave of unbearable heat and the sickening smell of blood. She saw younger Silas kneeling in the mud, screaming as his father bled out in his arms. She saw the town turning their backs on him, calling him a monster for defending his own home. She blinked rapidly, tearing herself back to the present. The agony in Silas's eyes was so raw it stole her breath. Fitzgerald had orchestrated the destruction of Silas's family. Clara swallowed hard. Her trembling hands reached back into the satchel. She pulled out a final folded piece of thick parchment. It was stained. A dark, rusty brown color flaked off the edges. Dried blood. It was a letter addressed to her father, Thomas Wynne. Thomas, it read, you ask too many questions about the missing funds. If you open your mouth to the judge tomorrow, I will ensure your daughter inherits nothing but a coffin. H.F. The letter slipped from Clara's fingers. It fluttered to the wooden floor like a dead leaf. Her father hadn't died of a sudden heart failure. He was murdered, and the debts, the auction, it was all a lie to silence her forever. The quiet anger inside Clara didn't fade, it crystallized. It turned into pure, cold steel. Her knees buckled under the crushing weight of the truth. Before she could hit the floor, Silas was there. He caught her. His massive arms wrapped completely around her trembling body, pulling her tight against his broad chest. She buried her face in his coarse flannel shirt. She didn't sob aloud, but her body shook violently as silent tears of pure rage soaked into his chest. Silas held her. He rested his bearded chin softly on the top of her head. One massive hand slowly, gently stroked her back. I found it in the bank vault the night I killed the Kellermans, Silas whispered, his voice cracking. I took it to prove my innocence. But the sheriff was on his payroll. They hunted me into the mountains. I've been waiting 10 years, Clara, waiting for someone brave enough to help me bring him down. He pulled back just enough to look into her eyes. He gently wiped a tear from her cheek with his rough thumb. I watched him sell you today, Silas rumbled, his eyes burning with a fierce protective fire, and I swore to God he would never hurt you again. Clara looked at the beast. She saw the man, the protector, the warrior who had suffered in silence just like her. She reached up. Her small, pale hand rested flat against his bearded cheek. It was a voluntary touch, a profound, undeniable connection. We will destroy him, Clara whispered. Her voice was no longer defensive. It was a promise of war. Silas closed his eyes, leaning into her touch. For one beautiful, heartbreaking second, they were just two shattered souls, finding the missing pieces of themselves in the dark. Ooh! The haunting, savage howl of a hunting hound ripped through the freezing night. Silas's eyes snapped open. The softness vanished instantly, replaced by the lethal instincts of a predator. Bark! 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 The sound was closer now, much closer. Then came the heavy, chaotic thud of horse hooves tearing through the snow just outside the cabin window. Multiple riders, they had found them. Silas shoved Clara behind his massive body. He reached down and grabbed his Winchester rifle, jacking around into the chamber with a deafening clack. Boon! A rough, drunken voice roared from outside. It was the sheriff. Come out with your hands up, beast. We know you stole the girl. The trap had snapped shut. The banker had sent his dogs. Bark! 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 The hounds tore at the thick wooden door, their claws frantically scratching the timber. The harsh, erratic glow of burning pitch torches bled through the cracks in the window shutters, painting the dark cabin in streaks of violent, bloody orange. Boon! The sheriff's drunken voice roared again, accompanied by the metallic clicks of revolvers being cocked. Come out, or we burn you out. Silas stood like a towering monument of stone in the center of the room. His Winchester was raised, the cold steel barrel leveled dead center at the heavy oak door. His jaw was clenched so tight, the muscles trembled. He was ready to kill. He was ready to die. Clara stood behind him, clutching the leather satchel to her chest. Her heart hammered wildly against her ribs. Then, the shouting outside abruptly stopped. The hounds were silenced with a sharp command. Footsteps crunched slowly, deliberately through the freezing snow. They stopped right at the edge of the wooden porch. "Stand down, Sheriff. Put the weapons away." The voice was smooth, cultured, entirely too calm for a raid in the dead of night. It was Harold Fitzgerald. "We are civilized men." The banker's voice drifted through the wooden planks, carrying the chilling warmth of a concerned father. "We are not here to spill blood. We are here for a rescue." Silas's grip on the rifle tightened until his knuckles turned completely white. A low, dangerous growl rattled in his chest. "Clara, my dear," Fitzgerald called out, his tone dripping with fake sympathy. "I know you are terrified. I know this animal dragged you up this mountain against your will. The whole town saw it. We are here to bring you home." Clara's breath hitched. Her nails dug violently into the heavy leather of the satchel. The quiet anger inside her roared. "He murdered my father. He sold me like cattle, and now he plays the savior." "I know what you found, Clara," Fitzgerald continued, his voice lowering, becoming an intimate, rational whisper meant only for her. "Jacob Morrison was a deeply troubled young man. He stole things from my bank, important documents. He hid them up there with the beast. I've been trying to retrieve them for the good of Cedar Falls." Fitzgerald paused. The wind howled briefly, filling the heavy silence. "Listen to reason, Clara," the banker pleaded beautifully. "Think about your reputation. Think about your father. Thomas Wynne was a respected man. If you walk out of that door right now and hand me Jacob's stolen bag, you will be a hero, a poor, innocent victim who survived the beast of Elkhorn Ridge. I will personally forgive every debt your father owed. You will have your house back, your life back. You will be safe." The trap was utterly brilliant. It wasn't a threat. It was a golden bridge built on a foundation of lies. He was giving her a way out. He was offering her exactly what she had wanted yesterday. But Fitzgerald's voice turned dangerously soft. "If you stay in there, if you side with a known murderer, the law will see you as an accomplice, and the town, they will see you as a mad woman who fell in love with her kidnapper." Outside, the deputies murmured in agreement. Fitzgerald had them completely under his spell. He was the voice of reason. Silas was the irrational monster. Clara looked at Silas. The giant hadn't moved an inch, but his broad shoulders were slumped, crushed beneath a decade of lies. He had heard this speech before. 10 years ago, Fitzgerald had convinced the town that Silas's father was a thief, and that Silas was a rabid dog that needed to be put down. History was repeating itself. The beast was about to be slaughtered to protect the saint. Silas slowly lowered his rifle. He didn't look back at her. "Take the bag," Silas whispered. His voice was completely broken, hollow. "Walk out." Clara stared at his broad back. "He will kill you," she breathed. "I am already dead, Clara," Silas answered, the agonizing truth echoing in the dark cabin. "I died 10 years ago, but you can live." He reached out, his massive hand wrapping around the heavy iron bolt of the door, ready to open it and surrender himself to the mob so she could walk free. We are not always angry at the person in front of us. Sometimes we are angry at every person who stood there before them. The real question is, when do we stop punishing the present for the sins of the past? When do we stop running and finally stand our ground? Clara's hands stopped trembling. The quiet, defensive anger she had carried her entire life, the anger at her helpless mother, at her ruined father, at the cruel town, at herself, suddenly vanished. It didn't disappear. It forged itself into a blinding, unbreakable resolve. She wasn't a victim anymore. Before Silas could pull the iron bolt, Clara stepped forward. She dropped the heavy leather satchel onto the floor with a loud thud. She reached out and forcefully clamped her hands over Silas's massive arm, stopping him from opening the door. Silas turned his head, shock flickering in his weary gray eyes. "I am not leaving without you," Clara said. Her voice wasn't quiet anymore. It was hard, unyielding. Outside, Fitzgerald's patience finally snapped. The mask of the reasonable monster cracked. "Clara!" Fitzgerald's voice lashed out like a whip, sharp and venomous. "I am trying to save you. Do not force my hand." Silence from the cabin. "Very well," the banker sighed, a cold, theatrical sound of tragic disappointment. "Sheriff, the girl has been corrupted by the beast. They are beyond saving." Splash! The overpowering, sickening stench of raw kerosene suddenly seeped under the doorframe. They were dousing the wooden porch. "Burn it down," Fitzgerald ordered coldly. "Burn the beast to ash." The sharp, chemical stench of raw kerosene bled through the floorboards, burning Clara's lungs. Outside, the wind held its breath. Scratch! The harsh, distinct sound of a match striking wood echoed in the freezing night. Silas lunged forward. He didn't aim his rifle. He threw his massive body over Clara, ready to use his own flesh and bone to shield her from the incoming inferno. He was fully prepared to burn so she could live. He had given up, but Clara hadn't. The deputy outside raised the burning match toward the kerosene-soaked wood. Clara didn't scream. She didn't freeze. She twisted out of Silas's grip, reached down, grabbed the heavy Colt revolver from the floorboards, cocked the hammer, aimed blindly at the glowing cracks in the window shutter, fired, deafening crack. The heavy lid bullet pulverized the wooden shutter, exploding outward in a shower of splinters. Outside, the deputy shrieked in terror. The burning match slipped from his trembling fingers, landing harmlessly in a deep snowbank with a sharp hiss. Dead silence fell over the mountain. Inside the cabin, the heavy Colt smoked in Clara's pale, bruised hand. The recoil had sent a violent shockwave up her arm, but she didn't drop the gun. Her quiet anger had finally broken its cage. It wasn't defensive anymore. It was lethal. She didn't look at Silas. She marched straight to the heavy oak door. She grabbed the hot iron bolt, ripped it back, and kicked the door wide open. The freezing mountain wind howled into the cabin, whipping her thin cotton dress and loose hair around her face. She stepped out onto the kerosene-soaked porch. For the first time, the men of Cedar Falls saw the ruined woman. She wasn't cowering. She wasn't crying. She stood tall in the freezing snow, the heavy revolver gripped tightly in her hand. A second later, Silas stepped out right behind her, a towering, terrifying mountain of muscle and shadow, his Winchester leveled at the sheriff's chest. He didn't step in front of her. He stood beside her, her shield and her sword. "She's gone mad!" Fitzgerald yelled, his calm facade shattering as he backed away behind the deputies. "Shoot the beast! Shoot them both!" The deputies raised their rifles, hands trembling. "Do it!" Clara roared. Her voice cut through the howling wind like a blade of pure steel. It wasn't the hysterical scream of a victim. It was the heavy, terrifying command of a judge. The deputies froze. They had never heard a woman speak with such absolute, unapologetic authority. Clara raised her left hand. Clutched in her fingers was the thick leather ledger and the blood-stained letter. "You want to know what the beast was hiding?" Clara demanded, her eyes burning into the sheriff. She threw the ledger violently into the snow at his horse's feet. "Read it! Read how your righteous banker stole $4,000 from the town's emergency fund in '76. Read how he bought your badges." The sheriff looked down at the book. His horse nervously stamped its hooves. Fitzgerald's face drained of all color. "Lies! The writings of a madman." Clara took a step forward, off the porch, right into the freezing snow. "And this?" Clara held up the blood-flaked parchment, her voice trembling, not with fear, but with a profound, earth-shattering grief. "This is a letter Harold Fitzgerald wrote to my father, threatening to kill him if he went to the judge about the missing money. 2 days later, my father was dead." A heavy, suffocating shock wave rippled through the posse. The deputies lowered their rifles, turning to look at the banker. "He murdered my father," Clara stated, her voice dropping to a deadly quiet register. She turned her blazing eyes back to the crowd. "And 10 years ago, he paid the Kellerman gang to murder Silas's family just to steal the water rights to this mountain." She didn't point the gun at Fitzgerald. She pointed it at the deputies. "He sold me like an animal to silence me. And you," she sneered, the absolute disgust dripping from every word, "all of you, stood by and let him do it, because it was easier to blame a woman. It was easier to hunt a beast, because facing the real monster in your town took too much courage." Fitzgerald realized he was losing them. The carefully constructed web of lies he had built for 15 years was burning to the ground in the snow. His eyes darted wildly. He reached inside his tailored wool coat. Fitzgerald pulled out a silver derringer, aimed it straight at Clara's chest. Silas roared, moving to take the bullet. Clara didn't flinch. She didn't think. She raised the heavy Colt, aimed, fired, crack. Fitzgerald screamed. The silver derringer spun out of his hand, landing in the snow. Blood bloomed like a dark, ugly rose on his right shoulder. He collapsed to his knees, clutching his arm, whimpering like a wounded rat in the dirt. Clara stood breathing heavily, the smoking gun still leveled at the bleeding man. The deputies didn't move. They didn't raise their weapons. They just stared in absolute awe at the woman they had cast out, standing victoriously over the man who had owned them all. Clara slowly lowered the gun. She didn't shoot to kill. She shot to survive. She turned around and looked up at Silas. The giant mountain man was staring down at her. His chest was heaving. His gray eyes were wide, shining with an emotion so raw, so profound, it stole the breath from her lungs. He wasn't looking at a broken woman. He was looking at an equal, a warrior. True strength is not found in violence. True strength is not the ability to swing an axe or break a bone. True strength is the courage to stand between the monsters of this world and the one you have chosen to love. We do not fight just to survive the dark. We fight so that the one standing beside us can finally see the light. The sheriff slowly dismounted his horse. He walked over, picked up the ledger from the snow, and then looked down at the bleeding, pathetic figure of Harold Fitzgerald. "Cuff him!" the sheriff muttered to his men, his voice heavy with shame. He didn't look at Silas. He didn't look at Clara. He simply turned his horse around, leading the arrested banker back down the mountain, back to the justice of Cedar Falls. The hounds were quiet. The wind settled. The world of men retreated, leaving the mountain in absolute peace. Silas took a slow, heavy step down into the snow. He stopped right in front of Clara. He gently reached out. His massive, scarred hand closed over her small, trembling fingers, slowly lowering the heavy Colt revolver until it hung safely at her side. He didn't say thank you. Words were too small for what she had just done. He simply looked down at her, the decade of exhaustion, grief, and exile finally washing away from his face. The beast was dead. The man was finally home. The cabin was quiet again, not the terrifying, suffocating silence of a prison. It was the deep, settling quiet of a storm that had finally broken. Fresh pine logs crackled merrily in the stone hearth. The warm, golden firelight danced across the log walls, driving the freezing mountain shadows back into the corners. The bitter stench of kerosene and gun smoke had vanished, replaced by the rich, comforting aroma of fresh coffee and wood smoke. Silas sat heavily in the wooden chair beside the fire. He looked exhausted. A decade of carrying the weight of the world had finally caught up to him. Clara stood by the table. She wasn't shivering anymore. Silas slowly reached into the deep pocket of his heavy wool coat. He pulled out the thick leather pouch. The $3,000 in gold, the life savings he had slammed onto the church altar just that morning. He set it gently on the wooden table right in front of her. Clara looked at the pouch. Just hours ago, it had been the price of her cage, a symbol of her humiliation. "The sheriff will take the ledgers to the judge," Silas rumbled softly, his gray eyes fixed on the fire. "Your father's name will be cleared. The bank will have to return your home in Cedar Falls." He paused, taking a slow, deep breath. "That gold is yours," Silas continued, finally looking up at her. His eyes were wide, completely unguarded. "It's enough to get you to Denver or San Francisco, anywhere you want to go. You don't have to hide in the snow anymore, Clara. You're free." He was letting her go. After everything, he was still asking for nothing in return. Clara stared at the heavy pouch. She thought about the town down in the valley. She thought about the empty, cold house her father had built. Then she looked at the giant sitting in front of her, the man who had slept on a freezing floor to protect her, the man who was willing to burn alive so she could walk away. Clara reached out. She didn't take the pouch. She pushed it across the rough wooden table. Right back to him. The quiet, burning anger that had forged her spine for so long simply melted away. She didn't need the armor anymore. The war was over. "I am not running anymore," Clara whispered. It was the very first time she had spoken without a shield. No defiance, no thorns, just the raw, beautiful truth. She took a slow step closer, her hand gently resting on his broad, weary shoulder. "And I am already home," she said softly, her eyes locked with his. "If you'll have me." Silas's breath caught in his chest. His massive, calloused hand came up, gently covering her small fingers, resting on his shoulder. He closed his eyes, a profound, shuddering sigh escaping his lips. "You're safe here," Silas murmured, his voice thick with a quiet, overwhelming joy. "Always." Outside, the mountain wind sang a gentle lullaby through the pines. Home isn't a place on a map. It isn't a house built of brick and ledger books. Home is the person who makes you feel safe. It is the one who stands with you in the dark and helps you carry the light. She had not lost her way. She had only lost the world that didn't deserve her. And that night, beside the roaring fire, the beast and his warrior began to build a new one. Was this love strong enough to hold against everything the world would still throw at them? Love stories like this remind us that sometimes the world's most brutal rejection is exactly what leads us to the one place we truly belong. We spend so much of our lives trying to fit into spaces that were never meant for us, trying to please people who only know how to take. But Clara and Silas teach us that it's never too late to stop running. It's never too late to stand your ground, and it is never too late to let the right person see the soft heart you've hidden behind a wall of anger. I want to know, where are you right now as you listen to this? What city, what country, what quiet corner of the world are you in? Every time I read your comments, I am deeply reminded of how stories connect us across oceans, across backgrounds, and across lonely hearts. Thank you for walking up that snowy mountain with us today. And stay close, because if you believe in the second chances, and if you believe that the most broken souls often make the most beautiful love stories, the next story is meant perfectly for you. I'll see you then.